The old records in the Concord archives called him a weapon. Not a creature, not a person, a weapon. The filing was made 400 years ago by a clerk whose name nobody remembered, and nobody had ever bothered to change it. Somewhere in the deepest storage of the Concord central database, there was a file labeled VORKIDITH weapon class, extinction level. Below that, in smaller letters, someone had typed, "Do not engage, do not provoke. Do not make eye contact if avoidable." That last line was not a joke. It had been added by an admiral who had once looked Drath directly in the eye from the bridge of a warship and had never fully recovered from the experience. The Vorkai were the oldest race the galaxy had ever known. When the first Pelians were still figuring out fire, the Vorkai were already building cities in the clouds of gas giants. When the Concord was just a dozen species sitting around a table arguing over borders, the Vorkai had already watched 3 civilizations rise and fall without feeling the need to involve themselves. They were old in the way that mountains are old, and like mountains, they were easy to ignore right up until the moment they decided to move. Then came the Purge Wars. 4 centuries ago, an alliance of 7 species decided that something as powerful as the Vorkai was simply too dangerous to exist alongside the rest of the galaxy. The arguments they made were careful and well-reasoned and completely wrong. The war lasted 11 years. It ended not because the 7 species won, but because Drath, the last surviving Vorkai, opened a communication channel to every fleet, every council chamber, every inhabited world simultaneously, and spoke 4 sentences. He said, "I know where each of your home worlds is. I know where your hatcheries are. I know where you keep the things you love. If any weapon is fired at me again, I will begin with the smallest moon of your youngest colony, and I will not stop until I run out of things to burn." Nobody fired again. The treaty that followed was long and complicated and full of careful legal language. In practice, it meant this: Drath would go somewhere quiet and stay there, and the Concord would pretend he did not exist, and everyone would continue living their lives under the unspoken agreement that the last dragon could end all of this whenever he felt like it, and had simply chosen not to. He chose the dead world of Caen Voss. It had been a Vorkai hatchery once, before the wars. Now it was nothing, black glass plains stretching in every direction, dead volcanoes that had not erupted in centuries, no water, no atmosphere to speak of beyond a thin chemical smear that made the sky look bruised and wrong. The Concord's records listed it as uninhabited. Technically, this was accurate. Drath did not live there in any way the Concord's records understood. He simply was there, the way a stone is somewhere, settled and still and requiring nothing. He had not spoken to another being in 87 years. He did not miss it. On the 432nd day of his latest unbroken silence, a small silver shuttle dropped out of the upper atmosphere of Caen Voss and began looking for somewhere flat enough to land. Nella had not wanted this assignment. She had a list of things she had not wanted in the past 3 years, and this assignment sat near the top of it, just below the promotion that had come with it, and just above the fact that the childcare arrangement she had carefully organized for the 6-week survey mission had collapsed 4 days before departure when the woman she had hired announced she was moving to a different system. She had considered her options. She had made a decision. The decision was currently strapped to her chest in a padded harness, 8 months old, completely asleep, and drooling slightly onto the collar of Nella's survey jacket. Her partner on the mission, a young geologist named Rail, had said nothing about the baby when he boarded the shuttle on departure day. He had looked at Nella. He had looked at the baby. He had opened his mouth and then closed it again. He had found his seat and strapped in and stared at the instrument panel for a long time. "She's very quiet," he had finally offered, somewhere around the 3rd day of travel. "She's a good baby," Nella said. Rail had nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are processing something that does not quite fit into their understanding of how missions were supposed to work. The survey mission was straightforward enough on paper: Caen Voss, geological assessment, mineral content evaluation, file a report, 6 weeks, in and out, and then back to the station. The Concorde needed the data for long-term resource planning, standard procedure. What the briefing documents did not mention, and what Nella had found only in a footnote of a footnote buried in the appendices of the original Concorde filing on Cairn Voss, was the note that read, Long-term resident, Entity D, C file VK Weapon 0014DTALS, resident classified as non-interactive. Non-interactive, as if that settled it. The shuttle found a flat stretch of black glass about 3 kilometers from the largest dead volcano and set down with a sound like someone putting a cup gently on a table. The landing gear settled. The engines spun down. Outside the viewport, the sky was the color of an old bruise and absolutely nothing moved. Rail looked out the window for a while. "It's very quiet," he said. "It's a dead world," Nella said, unstrapping her harness and carefully adjusting the one holding Ori against her chest. The baby stirred, made a small sound, and went back to sleep. Dead worlds tend to be quiet. They set up base camp in the first hour. Nella was efficient and methodical and had done this on 11 different worlds. Rail was efficient too, though he kept pausing to look at the horizon with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and not quite making it. "There's something big been living here," he said, pointing to a section of the black glass plain about 500 meters out. The surface was not flat there. It was deeply scored, as if something enormous had rested on it for a long time, the way a stone leaves a mark in soft ground, except stone did not leave marks in volcanic glass, and whatever had made these marks had done so by sheer weight alone. "I know," Nella said. "The briefing documents." "I know," she said again. Rail was quiet for a moment. Then, should we be worried? Nella thought about the footnote. She thought about the 4 sentences that had ended a war. She thought about the 87 years of recorded silence from an entity that could, if it wanted to, reduce this shuttle to vapor before either of them had time to say anything interesting. "Probably not," she said. "He's been here for 400 years. We are here for 6 weeks. We just need to do our jobs and leave him alone." Rail did not look entirely convinced. He looked at the scored marks in the glass again. He looked at the large dead volcano. He looked at the base camp they had just set up, which was approximately 3 kilometers from the volcano and which felt, in this moment, like a very short distance. "Right," he said. "Sure, leave him alone." In the shadow of the volcano, in a space between 2 great ridges of cooled lava that was large enough to fit most buildings, something very old and very large and very patient watched the small silver shuttle with one half-open eye. Drath had not moved in 4 months. He did not need to. Movement required a reason, and he had not had one in some time. His last reason for moving had been to reposition himself slightly so that the sun, when it rose, would not shine directly into his eye during the early hours of the morning. This had required shifting approximately 12 meters to the left. He had done so carefully, so as not to disturb the ground too much. He watched the shuttle now with the part of his mind that noticed things and filed them away for later consideration. 2 humans, one of them carrying something very small. He was not sure what the small thing was at first. It was warm, he could tell that much, and it smelled of something that reminded him of certain plants that had grown on this world before the wars had turned everything to glass. He decided it was not worth caring about. He closed his eye. Somewhere in the deep quiet of Cairn Voss, under the bruised sky and the thin cold air, the last dragon went back to waiting for nothing in particular, and the humans 3 kilometers away began unpacking equipment that would, in 6 days' time, reveal something that would change everything. For now, though, the dead world was simply quiet. And quiet was what Drath had learned over 400 years to call home. It was the harness strap that did it. Nella had loosened the left shoulder strap of Ori's carrier during lunch because the buckle had been pressing into her collarbone for the past 2 hours and she needed 30 seconds of relief. She set her food down on the equipment crate. She adjusted the strap. She picked her food back up. She turned to check the atmospheric sensor readout on the nearest post, and in those 12 seconds, she counted them later. She counted them many times, Ori, who had recently discovered that her legs were strong enough to push against things, and that pushing against things made other things happen, pushed against the loosened left side of the harness with both feet, twisted in the particular way that Barbies can twist when they have decided they want to go somewhere, and worked her way free. She did not fall, she never fell. This was something Nella had noticed and could not entirely explain. Ori had a gift for landing well, for finding solid ground, for sitting down with a small satisfied thump rather than toppling. She landed on the black glass plane in exactly this way, looked around at the world with the expression she wore when presented with any new and interesting environment, and began moving. She did not crawl. She had not worked out crawling yet, though she was close. She did a thing that was somewhere between crawling and scooting and rolling, a sort of enthusiastic, determined forward motion that carried her across the ground with surprising speed. She had a direction. She always had a direction. The direction today was toward the large dark shapes at the base of the volcano, which were interesting because they were large and dark and shapes, and Ori had not yet reached the point in her development where large dark shapes meant anything other than new things to explore. Nella turned around 30 seconds later, and Ori was gone. What followed was not panic exactly. Nella did not panic. She had been trained not to panic. But there was a moment, lasting perhaps 3 full seconds, where she stood completely still, and her mind went very white and very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the fact that her daughter was not where she had been. She found the small tracks in the black dust that had settled over the glass plane. She followed them. She followed them for 400 meters. Then she stopped. Ori was sitting on the ground between the first 2 toes of what could only be described, if you were being scientific about it, as a foreclaw. If you were being honest about it, it was a claw that was larger than the shuttle they had arrived in, dark as old coal, and attached to a limb that disappeared upward into shadow and scale, and the vast quiet presence of something that had not moved, but was very much awake. Drath was looking at Ori. Ori was looking at Drath. More specifically, Ori had found one of his scales, a small one, by Voakai standards, which still meant it was roughly the size of a dinner plate, that had come loose and fallen to the ground at some point in the past few decades, and she was holding it in both hands and attempting to put the corner of it in her mouth. Nella did not breathe. She understood, in this moment, several things at once. She understood that she was looking at a creature before which 7 allied military fleets had retreated. She understood that she was 3 meters away from it, that it was watching her daughter, and that her daughter was trying to eat its shed scale with the cheerful persistence of someone who had not yet learned that there were things in the universe that should not be tasted. She also understood, though she could not have explained exactly how, that he had not moved, that he had been here, awake, watching her daughter approach from across the plain, and he had not moved. He could have moved. Moving was something Drath was perfectly capable of. He had chosen not to. This was important information. She kept her voice very low. She had read once that sudden noise startled predators in ways that movement alone did not, and while everything she was looking at suggested that Drath was not behaving like a predator, she was not inclined to test theories right now. "Okay," she said softly, the way she talked to Ori during the quieter parts of their evenings together when she was trying to get her settled. "We're just going to come and get her. She didn't know she was bothering you. She doesn't understand personal space yet. She doesn't understand most things yet. She's 8 months old." Drath said nothing. He was large in a way that was difficult to process from this close. His head, she could see part of it now as her eyes adjusted to the shadow, was somewhere above and to the left of her, and it was facing downward toward Ori, and his eye was open. His eye was gold, not a warm gold, not a bright gold, a deep, ancient gold, the color of something that had been burning very slowly for a very long time. It was the size of a window. It was looking at her daughter. Nella took one careful step forward, then another. Ori looked up from the scale. She saw Nella. She grinned, a wide, completely toothless, entirely delighted grin, and held up the scale as if showing it off. Then she looked back at Drath. She studied him with the serious, attentive expression she used when she was trying to work out what something was. Nella had seen this expression directed at ceiling fans, at the survey equipment, at a particularly interesting rock on the third planet they had passed on the way here. It was the expression of someone conducting a genuine investigation. Then, apparently having completed her investigation and reached some conclusion, Ori made a sound. "Bah," she said. It was not a word. It was not an attempt at a word. It was simply the sound that Ori produced when she had decided she was comfortable with something, a small noise of acceptance and approval, the same sound she made when Nella picked her up after a nap. Nella was watching Drath's eye. Something happened in it, something very small, something she almost missed, something she would not be able to describe accurately for the rest of her life, because the vocabulary for it did not exist in any language she spoke. It was not softening exactly. It was not surprise. It was more like the way a very old and very heavy door moves when something touches the latch, not opening, not yet, but registering the touch, acknowledging that a touch had occurred. He lowered his claw. Not much, a few degrees, enough. Nella stepped forward, crouched down, and picked up her daughter. Ori protested briefly. She had not been done with the scale, and then relented, settling against Nella's shoulder with a small grumbling sound and reaching up to pat Nella's jaw. Nella straightened up. She was standing now in the full presence of the last dragon, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his scales despite the cold air of Cairn Voss, and she was holding her daughter, and she was looking at the edge of his claw. "Thank you," she said. She was not sure why she said it. It seemed like the right thing. Drath said nothing. She turned and walked back across the plain, keeping her steps even, keeping her breathing controlled, and she did not look back until she had gone 200 meters. When she did look back, she could see the shadow at the base of the volcano, and somewhere in that shadow, a point of ancient gold that was still watching her. She turned around and kept walking. When she reached base camp, Rael was there with his geological sensors, completely absorbed in some reading that was making him frown at a screen. He looked up when she arrived. "Everything all right?" he asked, the way you asked someone who looked slightly unusual. Nella looked down at Ori, who was contentedly patting her collarbone and making small, interested sounds at the sky. "Fine," Nella said. "Everything's fine." She reattached the harness strap. She checked the buckle twice, then she checked it a third time. 3 kilometers away, in the shadow of the dead volcano, the last dragon lowered his great head back toward the black glass ground and was still again. But his eye did not close entirely. There was a fraction of gold still showing, catching the thin light of the bruised sky. He had not thought about the small warm thing that had come to him and made its small noise at him, and shown him its found treasure with such complete and uncomplicated pride. He was thinking about it now. He was not sure what to do with the thinking. He had not thought about something new in a very long time. Thinking about new things required a kind of openness that he had carefully closed off years and years ago, because openness led to caring and caring. For a creature that had outlived everything it had ever cared about was simply another word for pain. But the small thing had not cared about any of that. It had come to him across a dead plain on a dead world and looked at him with those round dark eyes and said bah, and then been collected by its equally small parent and carried away. Drath did not have a word in any language he spoke for what he felt. He settled for being still. It was, as always, the one thing he was very good at. On the 6th day, Rael's sensors stopped making sense. He had been running standard geological readings across the eastern plain for most of the morning, density mapping, mineral composition, subsurface layer analysis, the same work he had been doing every day since they arrived. It was not exciting work. It was the kind of work that required patience and careful attention to numbers and a willingness to walk long distances across flat, featureless ground while a computer beeped at intervals. Rael was good at it. He liked it in a quiet way, the same way some people like solving puzzles that have only one correct answer. The readings from the eastern section were fine, Standard composition for a world that had been volcanically active and then very suddenly stopped being volcanically active. Dense silicates, heavy minerals, the kind of subsurface structure you expected when a planet had cooled fast. Then he crossed an invisible line somewhere near the base of the second largest dead volcano, and the numbers changed. He stopped, he ran the scan again, the numbers stayed changed. He moved the sensor array 10 meters to the left and ran it again. Different numbers, but equally strange. He moved right, same thing. He pulled out his manual scanner and crouched down and pressed it against the glass surface and held it there for a full minute while it worked. When the reading came back, he sat down on the black glass plane and looked at it for a long time. Then he picked everything up and walked back to base camp at a pace that was slightly faster than his usual pace, though he would have said, if asked, that he was walking completely normally. Nella was at the camp, going over the atmospheric data from the previous 2 days. Ori was in her portable sleep unit, which was a padded enclosed pod that looked like a very small piece of luggage and made a soft humming sound that Ori found deeply agreeable. She was asleep. "Nella," Rail said. She looked up at his face and put down her screen. "Show me," she said. He showed her. She read the data. She read it again. She asked him 3 questions, checked his calibration settings, asked him whether he had run the backup scanner, found out he had, and then sat quietly for about 2 minutes. The readings were not showing natural mineral deposits. The subsurface composition under the eastern plain, under what turned out, when you pulled back the scan range and looked at the whole picture, to be a very large area surrounding the base of both major volcanoes, was not volcanic rock. It was not any kind of rock, exactly. What the sensors were reading was something that had once been organic, something that had been organic at very high temperatures. Something that had compressed, over 4 centuries, into the glass plane they had been walking across all week, because when living things are destroyed by sufficient heat, they leave traces that do not look like anything alive at all, and it takes the right kind of sensor to understand what you are actually looking at. The minerals in those readings were the remains of eggs. Not dozens, not hundreds. The scan area, when Rail extended it across the full range of the sensor array, covered roughly 40 square kilometers of the canvas surface. What lay beneath that surface, compressed, cooled, changed by 4 centuries into something that barely resembled what it had been, was the compressed remains of thousands of Vaokai eggs. Canvas had not simply been a world where the Vaokai happened to live. It had been their primary hatchery. This was where they had come to lay their eggs, for generations stretching back to before the Concord existed. This was where the next 1,000 years of Vaokai had been waiting to be born when the Purge Wars began. The attacking fleet had not simply killed the adult Vaokai who were present on the world at the time. They had killed everyone who was going to come after. They had killed them before they had a chance to exist. Nella set down the data screen and looked out at the black glass plane. The surface caught the thin light of the sky and gave it back in dim, colorless reflection. It looked empty. It was not empty at all. It was full, in the way that a grave is full, full of what had been, full of what would never be. Rail was very quiet. He was looking at the same plane. "He knows," Nella said. "It was not a question." "Has to," Rail said. "He's been here for 400 years. She thought about that. 400 years of sitting on the grave of every Vaokai who had never been born. 400 years of being the only thing left in the universe that knew what those names would have been, what those lives might have been, keeping watch not over bodies, but over the absence of what should have been living. She looked over at the sleep pod, where Ori was breathing in the small, steady way of something that had not yet learned that the universe could be unkind. "If it was Ori," she said quietly, "if someone had, if there had been." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Rail understood. Any parent would understand, and even people who weren't parents understood once they thought about it long enough. "What do we do with this data?" Rail asked. It was a practical question. He was asking because it was his job to ask, and because focusing on practical questions was easier than thinking about what the data actually meant. Nella understood this. She did it too, sometimes. She was about to answer when the communications relay on the equipment table gave a short tone and lit up amber. Incoming signal. Encrypted. Concord frequency. She did not recognize the encryption key at first. It was not the standard survey relay key. It was something older, something she had seen once in a training document and then never again. It was a Concord administrative frequency, not mission control, not the survey bureau. Administrative, governance level. She looked at Rail. He was frowning. "That's not our channel," he said. "No," she agreed. They should not have been able to receive it. They should not have been able to partially decode it. The fact that Rail's survey equipment included a broad-spectrum signal capture system designed for planetary communication archaeology, meant for picking up old signals baked into the geological record of inhabited worlds, meant that they received it and could strip the outer encryption layers even though they absolutely were not meant to. What they found inside was not addressed to them. It was addressed to a mining fleet. It named Cairn Voss. It named the mineral deposits. It used language about resource territory and uninhabited classification and the long-standing non-interference status of the resident entity. And then it used language about how the resident entity's silence over the past 8 decades indicated a low probability of active response to development activity. And then it gave coordinates, and those coordinates were the same coordinates that Rail had been scanning all morning. At the bottom of the signal was a sender identification code: Governor Srath, Pelion Administration, Senior Concord Council. Rail expanded the signal log. There were more transmissions. He traced the thread back 3 months. The survey mission, their survey mission, the one they were currently on, the one that was supposed to be a routine geological assessment, had been planned around this. The survey data they were collecting would be filed and used to formalize the resource claim. They had been sent here to provide documentation, not for the Concord's general records, for the mining application. And the mining fleet, Rail checked the navigation data in the signal, was not waiting to hear back. It was already moving. Estimated arrival at the edge of the Cairn Voss system, 14 hours. Nella stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at the plane again, at the 40 square kilometers of compressed ash and glass that had once been thousands of lives waiting to begin, at the shadow at the base of the largest volcano, where a point of gold was faintly visible even from here. "He doesn't know," she said. Rail looked up from the screen. "What?" "About the fleet, about the mining claim, he doesn't know." She paused. "Nobody told him." Nella. "Someone should have told the Vorkai what was happening to them 400 years ago," she said, "and nobody did. They just came and did it." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to do that." Rail opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He looked at the data screen. He looked at the distant shadow. He thought about what he was going to say and then did not say it because there was nothing to say. She was right. He knew she was right. It was the kind of right that makes your stomach feel heavy because it also means someone is about to do something that is going to be very hard. "I'll stay with Ori," he said finally. Nella nodded. She picked up the data pad with the survey results and the signal thread loaded onto it. She stood up straight. "If I'm not back in 2 hours," she said, "file the full signal intercept to the Concord main relay. Everything. The mining plan, Srath's transmission, the egg deposit data, all of it." "And if you are back?" Rail asked. She looked at the volcano. "Then we'll decide together what to do next," she said. She walked away from the camp toward the shadow, and the bruised sky was very quiet above her, and the black glass plain was very still beneath her, and somewhere ahead, behind all that ancient darkness, a point of gold light waited, patient as stone, as it had waited for 400 years. For the first time in 87 years, something was walking toward it with a purpose. 3 kilometers sounds short until you are walking them alone across a black glass plain on a dead world with no sound except your own boots and your own breathing and the very quiet awareness that where you are going has not been willingly approached by any living being in 87 years. Nella did not run. Running would have been wrong for reasons she could not entirely articulate. Something about the quality of this walk required that it be a walk, that it be deliberate, that each step be a step she had chosen rather than a step she was being pushed into. She had made this decision. She was going to make it at the correct pace. She had left her sidearm at camp. She had thought about this for about 4 seconds and then set it on the equipment table next to Rail, who had looked at it and then looked at her with an expression she chose not to examine too closely. A sidearm against Drath would be exactly as useful as a harsh word against a mountain. Carrying it would have meant she thought of this as a confrontation. She did not think of this as a confrontation. She thought of it as a conversation she needed to have. The shadow at the base of the volcano grew as she approached. The scale of it was difficult for her brain to process. From camp, the ridges of cooled lava that flanked Drath's resting place had looked like rock formations. Up close, she could see the difference in texture, the difference in density, the particular way they reflected light that was different from the plane. They were not rock formations. She stopped at what felt like a conversational distance, which is to say she stopped at the point where she could see him clearly and he was clearly looking at her, and the distance felt like the kind that you could talk across without shouting. This was approximately 40 meters. In front of her, 40 meters felt very short. Drath was awake. He had been awake since she left camp. She did not know this, but it was true. He had watched her cross the plain. He had watched her walk toward him without weapons and without hesitation, or rather with hesitation kept firmly on the inside where she probably thought it didn't show. He had extensive experience watching things approach him. Most things, when they approached, did so with the particular body language of things that were preparing to either fight or flee and could not yet decide which. This human was doing neither. She was walking toward him the way someone walks toward something they need to deal with. He found this interesting. He had not found something interesting in a long time. She stopped at 40 meters and looked up at him. Then she held up a flat-screen device that was small enough she was holding it in one hand, and she said, in a voice that was completely level except for the very faint vibration of controlled nerves underneath it, "I need to tell you something. I don't want to waste your time. I'm going to say it plainly, and then you can do whatever you decide to do." Drath said nothing. His eye was open and it was pointed at her, and that was all the invitation she was likely to get. She lowered the screen and looked at the data on it. "Our survey sensors found something under the eastern plane," she said. "What's under the glass is organic, compressed, 400 years old, but organic. We ran 3 different scans. They all say the same thing." She looked up at him. "Those are eggs, Voakai eggs, thousands of them. Cairn Voss was a hatchery." She watched his eye. She was watching it for the same thing she had watched for 3 days ago, when Ori had looked up at him in the shadow of his claw. There was no expression to read in any traditional sense, but there was something, some quality of attention, some shift in the depth of the gold that told her he was listening. She continued, "There is also this." She held the screen up again. "We intercepted a Concord administrative signal. It was not meant for us. We received it because of our scan equipment. It is from Governor Esarath Pelian administration." She read from the screen, "The signal authorizes a mining fleet to begin resource extraction on Cairn Voss. The fleet is already on its way. They will be at the edge of this system in 14 hours. She put the screen down. "They are planning to mine the eastern plain," she said. "The same area the eggs are in. They are calling it uninhabited resource territory. They are counting on you staying quiet, the way you have stayed quiet for 87 years, because their documentation says you are unlikely to respond." Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. She kept going, because she had come this far, and silence was not the same as being asked to stop. "I don't know what you want to do about this," she said. "That's not my decision. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here because someone should have told the Varkai everything that was being planned against them 400 years ago, and no one did. They came and they did what they did, and nobody stood in front of you first and said, 'This is what is about to happen. This is what they are planning.'" She paused. "I'm not going to be part of that. I won't make that mistake." Another silence. Then, and the sound of it was like a large thing slowly becoming less still, like the moment before an earthquake when the ground hums with something deciding to move. Drath spoke. His voice had not been used in 87 years. It sounded like it. It sounded like something geological, like the groaning of rock under pressure, like the low frequency of something very old deciding to vibrate at a speed most hearing could barely register. But the words were clear. The words were in standard Concord tongue, careful and precise, because whatever else had dimmed in 87 years of silence, his language had not. He said, "Why do you tell me this?" Nella had expected silence. She had expected fire, remotely possible. She had not quite expected a question. "Because it's yours to know," she said. "You came here without a weapon," he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was more like something being noted for the record. "A weapon wouldn't have helped," she said. "No," he agreed, "it would not have." A pause that lasted several seconds, long enough to make her aware of each one. "You are afraid of me." It would have been easy to deny it. She did not. "Completely," she said. "And yet you came." "I have a daughter," she said. "She's 8 months old. She came to you 3 days ago because she doesn't know yet to be afraid of things. I know to be afraid. I came anyway." She looked up at the vast shape of him against the bruised sky. "I understand what this place is now. I understand what's under the glass. I have a daughter and I understand, in a way I couldn't have understood before I had her, what it means to lose what should have lived, and what it would feel like to have the place where they should have been destroyed for awe." There was a silence that went on longer than the others. Nella waited. She was good at waiting. When Drath spoke again, his voice was still that geological sound, that deep harmonic that she felt in her chest as much as heard with her ears. But there was something else in it, not warmth exactly, something older than warmth, something that had been in storage for a very long time and was being very carefully, very partially removed from storage. "I have watched this world for 4 centuries, he said. "Many things have passed through, ships, probes, survey drones. I have never spoken to any of them." Nella said nothing. "You are the first," he said, "who came to me carrying something alive." She understood what he meant. She did not say so, she just waited. Then the ground shook. Not violently, not dangerously. It was a tremor, a deep resonance that spread out from the base of the volcano like a slow breath, and it was caused by Drath rising to his full height for the first time in longer than she could estimate. The glass plane made sounds under him, high and sharp, as scales that had rested on it for months lifted and broke the contact. He was very tall. She had thought she understood how tall. She had been wrong. He did not look at her when he rose. He looked at the sky, the thin, bruised sky of Cairn Voss, the sky that had been above him for 400 years. 3 kilometers away, every sensor on Rail's equipment table went into alarm simultaneously. Rail, who had been watching the volcano on the external camera feed, looked at the readings, looked at the camera, and sat down very carefully. At camp, Ori woke up from her nap at the sound of the ground trembling, looked around with the curious alert expression she wore when something had changed, and then, finding no cause for alarm, put her fist in her mouth and went back to considering the ceiling of her sleep pod. At the volcano, Nella looked up at the last dragon standing against the dying sky of the world he had kept for 4 centuries, and she waited to see what 4 centuries of careful stillness would do when it finally decided to move. The mining fleet had 14 ships. This was considered more than enough. The Cairn Voss operation was not a complex extraction job. The deposits were near the surface. The ground was already broken down by centuries of natural compression, and the world had no atmosphere worth protecting. 14 ships, standard drill rigs, a processing barge for the heavier mineral sorting, and they would be done in 8 months and on their way to the next job. The fleet commander, a Gretian named Ossivar, had done this 11 times on 11 different worlds. He expected this to be the 12th. He had already submitted the end-of-operation report template to his administrators and left the date blank. He was 3 hours from the edge of the Cairn Voss system when his navigation officer told him something was in the approach vector. He assumed it was debris. Dead systems collected debris. Then the sensor officer said it was not debris, and that it was, in fact, very large and very warm and oriented directly toward the fleet. And then every screen on every ship in the formation lit up simultaneously with a proximity alert that had no standard category classification, because nothing in the Concorde navigation database had a category for something this big that was also moving. Osavar looked at the screen. The screen showed him a thermal signature. The signature filled most of the screen. It was coming from something that was traveling through open space without a ship, without a suit, without any assistance whatsoever, because it did not need these things. He said, "Stop the fleet." They stopped the fleet. Commander Volg's warship arrived at the edge of the system 4 minutes later, having been dispatched the moment Concorde monitoring in the nearest sector recorded Drath's movement from the surface of Cairn Voss for the first time in 87 years. Volg was a military professional with 22 years of service and a reputation for keeping his head in difficult situations. He looked at the sensor readings and asked 2 questions. The first was, "Is that what I think it is?" The second was, "How do we not make this worse?" His tactical officer answered the second question by saying, "I do not think there is anything we can do to make this worse, Commander. With respect." Volg decided, on reflection, that the wisest command decision he could make was to put every weapon on his ship into passive mode, turn his emergency running lights on full, and open every communication channel he had. He said into the open channel, "Drath, this is Commander Volg, Concorde Peacekeeping Authority. We are not hostile. We are here to observe. We are requesting that all parties remain calm." Silence on the channel for 11 seconds. Then Drath spoke. He did not speak to Volg. He did not speak to Osavar. He opened a signal on the broadband Concorde frequency, the frequency that every ship, every station, every populated world in the Concorde monitored at all times for emergency transmissions, the frequency that had not been used for anything other than automated navigation alerts in 6 years. He opened it and he spoke, and what he said went to every receiver in range simultaneously, which meant every receiver within 40 light minutes in every direction, and those receivers would relay it, and within 3 hours it would reach the Concorde High Council chamber, and within 4 hours it would be on every public communications network that existed. He said, "I am going to tell you their names." No one on any of the 14 ships understood, at first, what this meant. He told them. He began with Vorkai, who had died in the first year of the Purge Wars 403 years ago. He gave each name in full. The Vorkai naming convention was long, built on nested identifiers of lineage and place and the year of hatching, and each name, in the original Vorkai tongue, took time. He did not rush. He had been carrying these names for 400 years, and he was not going to say them quickly now. He said each one carefully and completely, the way you say a name when you want to be sure it is heard. The channels stayed open. Nobody interrupted. Nobody knew how. Osavar's ship was very quiet. The mining fleet was very quiet. Volg's warship was very quiet. Every crew member on every vessel had stopped doing whatever they had been doing and was simply sitting or standing or leaning against whatever was nearest and listening. The names went on for a long time. Drath named the adults who had died in the first strikes. He named the ones who had died in the second wave, the ones who had fought back, the ones who had run, the ones who had tried to negotiate and been killed while negotiating. He named the Vorkai who had been on worlds other than Cairn Voss when the hatchery was destroyed, the ones who had not been there, who had heard the news from a distance, who had made their way back to find glass where eggs had been and had simply stopped, the way certain creatures stop when they have lost the thing that was the point of continuing. He named all of those. Then he named the ones who had never been born. He did not give them full names. They had not received full names yet. He gave them what they had been given before hatching, the pre-names, the placeholder identities that Vorkai families used to refer to the young before they emerged. These were shorter. There were more of them, he said each one. On Volg's ship, the communications officer realized somewhere around the first hour, that she had been writing them down. She was not sure when she had started. She kept going. When he finished, the silence on the broadband channel lasted long enough that Osava thought, briefly, that the transmission had ended. Then Drath spoke again. He said, Cairn Vos is a burial site. It is the burial site of everyone whose name you have just heard. Under Article 9 of the Concord Charter of Species Preservation and Heritage Recognition, I am formally registering Cairn Vos as protected Vorkai heritage territory. I am the representative of my species. I am filing this registration now, on this channel, in the presence of the recorded witnesses currently in this system, and I am requesting the acknowledgement of the Concord High Council. Article 9 had existed in the Concord Charter since the founding. It had been put there to protect the cultural and biological heritage sites of any species that had representation in the Concord. It had never been used. There had never been a species so reduced that their entire heritage was in need of total protection. There had never been a case that met the criteria until now. Governor Esarath's voice appeared on the channel 17 minutes later, having been patched in from the Concord administrative relay. He sounded the way bureaucrats sound when they are trying to remain calm and precise while everything they planned is being very publicly dismantled. He said, the Article 9 provision requires representation by a recognized member body of not less than. Drath said, I am the member body. The provision specifies plural representation. I am the entirety of my people. Every vote is mine. The motion carries. A silence. Then another voice, older, careful, the voice of Councillor Prav from the Concord High Council, who had been listening since the first hour and who had the legal texts open on a screen in front of him and had been reading them very carefully for the past 40 minutes. Councillor Prav said, the Concord High Council acknowledges the filing. A pause. Cairn Vos is entered into the Heritage Register. All extraction or development activity on the registered site is suspended pending full review. Another pause, longer. The fleet currently approaching the system is directed to withdraw. Osavar was already turning his ships around before the sentence was finished. He would file his own report later. The report would be brief. On the channel, Esarath attempted to speak again. Several things happened to his transmission before it reached the relay. Some of them were technical. Some of them were the result of other council members overriding his access. The end result was that his voice did not reach the channel. Drath said nothing further. He turned in open space, a movement so large it would have shown on any long-range sensor in the quadrant as an event, and went back toward Cairn Vos. He came down through the bruised, thin sky of the dead world at a speed that should not have been possible for something so large, and yet he was precise, and the landing raised a great wave of fine black dust across the plain that settled slowly in the thin air, and then he was back in his place at the base of the volcano, and he was still. Back at base camp, Rail had captured everything, every signal, every name, every word of the exchange. His survey equipment had better broadband reception than anything else in the area, and it had been running on automatic record since the first tremor, and he had watched it all on his screen with Ori on his knee because she had woken up and he had picked her up and then forgotten to put her down. Ori watched the screen with the same serious attention she gave to everything new. When the transmission ended and the screen showed only signal data and Rail exhaled a breath that he felt like he had been holding for 2 hours, she looked up at him and made a small sound. Yeah, Rail said, me too. On the equipment table, one sensor was still sending readings. It was a ground vibration sensor set up to monitor tectonic activity. In the past hour, it had been giving readings that the software categorized as significant ground event, cause unknown, see manual for guidance. The manual had no guidance for this. The sensor was simply recording that the ground at the base of the largest dead volcano on Cairn Vos was vibrating very gently, in a low rhythmic way, like something breathing. It had not done this before. It would keep doing it now, steady and slow, for the next 12 hours. Nella arrived back at camp an hour after the transmission ended. She had walked the 3 kilometers back in the same deliberate way she had walked them out, though she was quieter now in a way that Rael recognized as the quiet of someone who has seen something they will spend the rest of their life thinking about. She sat down. She looked at Ori, who was still on Rael's knee, looking at things with her usual comprehensive interest. She reached over and took her daughter and held her for a moment. "Is it done?" Rael asked. "It's done," Nella said. She held Ori and looked at the sky, and the sky above Cairn Voss was still bruised and thin and cold, and 3 kilometers away the last dragon breathed slowly against the grave of his people, and the names he had carried for 400 years were now, finally, on the record. In the days that followed, the Concord did what large bodies of governance always do when something unexpected happens: it produced paperwork. There were official filings, formal objections from SRAth that were reviewed and dismissed in descending order of patience by 3 separate council committees, appeals that went nowhere, and a full investigation into how a mining contract had been authorized for a site that any thorough legal review would have flagged as potentially registrable under Article 9. The investigation found that the review had not been thorough. It found several other things that were worse. SRAth was suspended pending the full report. The mining contracts were voided. 14 ships that had been heading home returned their equipment to storage and waited for their next job. Cairn Voss was formally entered into the Concord Heritage Register as a Class 1 protected site, the first ever so designated for a species with a single surviving member. The Concord had to create a new administrative category for this. Nobody could agree on what to call it at first. Eventually, someone suggested guardian species, a species so reduced in number that its sole survivor was designated both member and custodian. The motion passed. It was added to the charter as a footnote to Article 9. The footnote was longer than the original article. Nella and Rael finished their work. Not the work they had been sent to do. That report they filed the same day they intercepted SRAth's transmission, marked with a full evidence package that left no room for ambiguity. What they finished in the remaining days was the survey they were actually doing, the careful documentation of every section of the Cairn Voss plain, the full mapping of the egg deposit area, the geological analysis that would support the heritage designation and give the Concord's legal teams something solid to anchor the protection on. They did this work carefully. They did it because it was right and because it needed to be done, and nobody asked them to, and Nella noted, with professional satisfaction, that the final report was the most thorough survey document she had ever produced. On the last morning, she woke before Rael and before Ori, and she sat outside the shuttle and looked at the sky. The sky of Cairn Voss was always the same bruised color, neither dawn nor dusk, just permanently that shade of something between gray and dark and wrong. She had spent nearly 3 weeks under it. She had stopped noticing it after the first few days, the way you stop noticing the sound of your own shuttle's engines. Now, on the last morning, she noticed it again. She thought about what this world had been. She thought about what it still was. Both things were true at the same time, and she was not sure she had the words for either. Rael began loading the survey equipment into the shuttle at mid-morning. Ori had been awake since early, which was her habit, and was currently sitting in her padded travel seat watching Rael work with an expression of focused supervision that Rael had learned, over 3 weeks, to largely ignore. He packed the sensor arrays first, then the communication relay, then the portable camp units. He was loading the last crate when Nella put her hand on his arm. He stopped. He looked at what she was looking at. Drath was moving across the plain. He was not moving quickly. He was moving the way he had moved every time they had seen him move, with the particular care of something very large that is aware of how much space it takes up, the way it placed each step so that the ground had time to settle before the next one. He was not approaching fast. He was approaching in the way that you approach when you want to make sure you are seen coming. He stopped at the edge of the camp, the same distance as before, 40 meters, as if he remembered it, as if it was the distance that had been established as reasonable. Rael looked at the shuttle door behind him. He looked at Nella. He stood very still. Nella stepped forward with Ori. She had not planned this. She had thought vaguely that they would simply leave, that Drath would know they were leaving and would not come, and that would be that. She had thought about sending some kind of communication, though she did not know what she would say in it. She had not expected him to come to them. She walked forward a little, not the full distance, just enough to be clear that she saw him and was not backing away. She stopped about 20 meters from the edge of the camp, 20 meters from where Drath had stopped, so that they were perhaps 40 meters apart again, and the bruised sky was above them, and the black plain was under them, and everything was very quiet. Ori was awake and looking at Drath. She recognized him. Nella could tell this clearly, because the face Ori made when she encountered something for the first time was different from the face she made when she encountered something again. This was the second face, a face of recognition, not discovery. A face that said, "I have seen you before, I know what you are." Drath looked at Ori. Ori looked at Drath with her round, dark eyes. Then she did what she had done the first time, in the shadow of his claw, because she was 8 months old, and 8 months old is an age at which you have not yet learned to do anything other than what you feel like doing. She grinned. It was the same grin, wide, completely toothless, entirely uncomplicated, a grin that had nothing in it except the pure simple fact of being pleased to see something again. She reached out one hand toward him, a hand that was not even slightly capable of reaching him at this distance, and she made a small sound of pure, uncomplicated delight. Nella was watching Drath's face. She had spent 3 weeks watching his eye when she needed to understand what he was thinking, because there was nothing else to read. His face was not a face in any way her brain was built to interpret expressions from, but his eye she had learned something about, even in a short time, and she watched it now. The change in it was not large. It would not have been visible to anyone who had not been paying very close attention for several days, but she had been paying very close attention. She had seen this before, not in a dragon's eye. She had seen it in her grandmother's face when Ori was born and Nella had carried her into the hospital room and placed her in the old woman's arms for the first time. She had seen it in her senior colleague at the Survey Bureau, a man who had been doing this work for 30 years and thought he had seen everything. The first time he held Ori at 4 months old, and Ori had looked up at him with that complete, evaluating attention of hers and decided he was acceptable. She had seen it in a neighbor who had lost her own children young, and who Nella sometimes saw watching Ori from across the corridor with an expression that tried to be neutral and was not quite. It was what happens to the faces of people who have known grief for a long time when they encounter something that has not been touched by it yet. It was not happiness, exactly. It was older than happiness and more complicated and also quieter. Drath smiled. His teeth were the length of a grown human. His mouth was wide enough to be its own event. The smile was not small, because nothing about him was small, but it was the quietest expression she had ever seen on something so large. It was the smile of something vast and tired that was, for one moment, choosing to let something in instead of keeping everything out. She heard it before she saw the rest, a sound, low and deep and so slow it was almost not a sound at all, that came from somewhere in his chest. Not a roar, not a growl, something warmer than either, something she did not have a name for. Drath said, and his voice was still that geological thing, that deep harmonic, but it was different now from the day she had walked to him across the plain, different the way a room is different when a window is opened. She is the first new thing I have permitted myself to notice in a very long time. Nella said, "She does that to people." He looked at Ori a moment longer, then he inclined his head. She had seen this gesture described in the archives once in an account of a Vaokai greeting ceremony from before the wars. It was a bow, a small one by his standards. It meant something. Then he turned and walked back toward the volcano, back to his place, and the ground shook gently under his steps, and the black dust rose and settled, and he was still again. Rael had not moved. When Nella walked back to him, he was looking at his screen. The survey equipment was still running and had been recording everything, and his expression was the one she associated with him encountering numbers that didn't fit any of his existing categories. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Then, did he just?" "Yes," she said. They loaded the last of the equipment. Nella strapped Ori into her travel seat in the shuttle and checked the buckle twice, and then a third time, and Ori supervised this process with patient tolerance. The shuttle lifted off from the black glass plane at midday. Rail pulled up the long-range sensor feed as they cleared the lower atmosphere. The image was clear, the plain below them, the dead volcanoes, the shadow at the base of the largest one where Drath was still, small now from this altitude but visible. Rail watched the image as the shuttle climbed. He said, "Do you think he'll be all right?" Nella was holding Ori, who was looking out the viewport at the planet growing smaller below them with the comprehensive interest she brought to everything new and to everything she was seeing for the last time without yet knowing it. Nella looked at the planet for a moment. She thought about 400 years of silence. She thought about a name spoken on a broadband channel to every receiver in range, and another name, and another, until every name was said, and the silence after was a different kind of silence from the silence before. She thought about a large eye in the shadow of a dead volcano and what she had seen move behind it. "He knows someone noticed," she said. "That's not nothing." The shuttle broke atmosphere and the stars came out, clear and cold and everywhere, and Cairn Voss fell away behind them, dead and dark and kept. 3 kilometers from where their shuttle had sat, in the same place he had rested for 400 years, the last dragon was still. His eye was closed. The ground vibration sensor they had left behind, they had forgotten it, and would only remember it 3 days later, and would file a retrieval note that was still pending when Rail retired, many years afterward, continued its patient recording. It recorded what it had recorded since the day of the transmission, the slow, low, rhythmic vibration from the base of the volcano, in and out, steady, even. The software still had no category for it. The closest match in its database, which it offered hesitantly in the error log that nobody ever read, was sustained biological resonance, origin unknown, pattern consistent with, breathing, deep sleep, or category incomplete, further data required. The last line of the error log, added automatically by the software's pattern recognition function after another 12 hours of recording, read, alternative pattern match, low confidence, possible classification. Sustained VOCALSATION, type unknown, does not match any CATALOGUED species. It was not silence, it had not been silence since that day. In the deep black of Cairn Voss, on the grave of everyone he had ever known and everyone who had never been born to be known, the last dragon was making a sound that the machines had no word for. But if you had been there, standing on the black glass plane in the thin cold air, you might have stood very still and listened and decided, after a while, that the closest word for it, in any language you knew, was something like singing.